Hey everybody, I'm Aaron Simmons. This is Philosophy for Where We Find Ourselves, November 6th, 2023. So today what I want to do is dig a little bit deeper, a little bit more technically, into an issue that I get a lot of questions about when I'm out giving talks about my new book, Camping with Kierkegaard. People will come up afterwards and say, hey, you mentioned this idea in passing. What's going on with Continental Philosophy of Religion? That's a mouthful. What does that mean? So what I'm going to do today, and probably for the next couple of weeks, is try to unpack different aspects of Continental Philosophy of Religion. But today I'm going to start just by giving you a broad account, a particular notion of some of the history and a few of the key ideas. In order to think about Continental Philosophy of Religion, we've got to say, well, continental as opposed to what? And the idea here is as opposed to, or in contrast to, is probably a better way to put it, Analytic Philosophy of Religion. Now, I should note that there are also varieties such as process philosophy of religion, there's pragmatic philosophy of religion, there's a variety of other ways forward, but the big players in the game are continental and analytic. Now, the difference between continental and analytic philosophy itself is a huge topic of debate. Philosophers on either side of the issue, of course, are going to have a variety of takes, a variety of accounts of really what's going on in this notion. But what I'm going to suggest is basically this. Analytic philosophy of religion, at its most basic, is committed to a particular kind of model of inquiry located in the scientific practice. So, in other words, what we do as philosophers is the same kind of thing that scientists do. We are trying to achieve rigor and precision. We are trying to analyze concepts. We're trying to engage in, we might call it, a kind of intellectual experimental method in order to get at objective accounts so far as possible. This is why you'll see analytic philosophers of religion suggest that we should strip away metaphor, get rid of examples that are too confused with embodiment, try to avoid complicated discussions of social context, and instead be invested in what is it about the arguments, what is it about the views, what is it that can be then considered in this quasi-objective mode relative to the topics and issues in play in philosophy of religion. Now, in contrast, continental philosophers, broadly speaking, are more invested in what we might call an existential and embodied or lived dynamic as plays out in this notion that we call religion. Now, I've got to say that this distinction, of course, is one that really plays out more as a matter of style than it does as a matter of actual content and substance. So I think there are great examples of poetically inclined analytic discourse. There are also deeply personal, deeply embodied, deeply existentially oriented analytic thinkers. Kevin Tempe, Nick Wolterstorff, Michelle Panchuk. There's a variety of thinkers in that space doing amazing work in ways that are traditionally, you might say, associated with some of the ideas that continental philosophers have unpacked. Alternatively, there are plenty of continental philosophers deeply concerned with the analytic rigor of good argumentation, conceptual clarity, and really trying to make sure that the evidence for the claims that are being presented is presented in clear ways so that it can be considered and engaged and criticized by the community of peers. That said, this distinction, again, as a matter of style, does kind of show up fairly commonly. Continental philosophers do tend to be a little bit less clear at the level of linguistic utterance. They do tend to be a little bit more comfortable with poetics, and analytic philosophers do tend to appeal a little bit more to what we might call a scientific mode as the style in which they are most often comfortable. With that basic distinction articulated between continental and analytic as really a kind of style difference more than actual content difference, we could then also say, well, who then are the kind of forerunners of this discourse? Well, it turns out that really continental philosophy of religion is anchored in primarily some 19th century thinkers, people like Hegel, Kierkegaard, as we move up, right? We've got the masters of suspicion, Marx, Freud, Nietzsche. These thinkers form the sort of background conditions, the background set. They offer the vocabulary of thinking about the various topics on offer in philosophy of religion in the continental mode. Alternatively, analytic philosophy has a much more, you might say, extended historical pedigree, or at least it is anchored in debates that extend, of course, far back: Aquinas, Anselm, Aristotle, etc. Now, any of this distinction drawing that I am trying to offer is super flawed. It's fallible. It is just an attempt to try to give you a kind of shape of these different ideas. Anything more rigid than that is inevitably going to go awry. So let me just say two more things for this video, and then we'll pick this up next week and go a little bit deeper. What is it that philosophy of religion in the continental mode is fundamentally oriented toward? Well, even though we've got a variety of different isms articulated within that space, French feminism, phenomenology, deconstructionism, existentialism, etc., critical theory, it's important to understand that what kind of unites all of them is a critique of a very particular conception of metaphysics, where metaphysics understands God as a very particular notion of being, grounded in a particular philosophical discourse rooted in, we might call, a kind of Greek inheritance. Continental philosophy of religion, whether it's Kierkegaard or Nietzsche or Derrida, are all a little bit worried about that metaphysical pedigree. In other words, if we anchor our discourse philosophically about religion, about God, about faith, about related ideas, what we've done is we've anchored that in a very particular philosophical contingent history that now threatens to make the very ideas on offer already question-begging internal to that Greek account. The worry here is that it gives into what is sometimes called ontotheology. Again, an idea that certainly needs unpacked on its own, but it's the idea that we understand God, the divine, the absolute, not in theological terms, but in philosophical ones. And those philosophical terms are anchored in a very particular notion of how being works as a concept. Now, that's a lot, but we've got to start somewhere. And I do think that a little bit of getting our toes in the deep end of the pool here will allow us to unpack as we move forward in future videos some of these ideas in more practical ways. So continental philosophy, analytic philosophy of religion, stylistic differences primarily, different ideals relative to which they understand what they're doing, a kind of scientific mode in one, a more embodied poetic mode in the other, and then the archive upon which they draw. The continental tradition is anchored in a kind of broadly existential 19th century inheritance that is critical of a very particular inherited Greek metaphysical model of God, of religion, of the absolute, as really best understood in terms of being. Okay, I'm going to pause there. We'll pick it up next week. And please drop some comments. Let me know if there are particular ideas in this broad idea of continental philosophy of religion that you'd like me to unpack as we move forward. I hope it's helpful. I'll see you next time, unless a piano falls on our heads.